To understand the rise of Spain as an empire, we must travel back to the late 15th century, when the Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of kingdoms, cultures, and rivalries. It was not yet a unified Spain as we think of it today, but rather a collection of realms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Granada, each with its own rulers, laws, and traditions. Out of this fragmented land, one of the greatest empires in history would slowly emerge. The key to this transformation lay in the marriage of two powerful monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their union in 1469 was more than a romantic arrangement. It was a political turning point. By combining their kingdoms, they created the foundation of a united Spain. Yet it was a union in name more than in structure. Castile and Aragon remained distinct, but their crowns now worked together toward common goals. One of those goals was the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberian territory from Muslim rule. For nearly 800 years, Christian and Muslim kingdoms had battled for dominance of the peninsula. By the late 1400s, Granada remained the last Muslim stronghold. In 1492, after a long siege, Granada finally fell to Ferdinand and Isabella's armies. With its fall, the Reconquista ended, and Spain was declared a fully Christian kingdom. But 1492 was important for another reason as well. That same year, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the sponsorship of Ferdinand and Isabella, crossed the Atlantic in search of new routes to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon lands unknown to Europeans, lands that would soon become the heart of Spain's empire. Columbus's voyage did not bring immediate riches, but it opened the door to an age of exploration, conquest, and colonization that would transform Spain into a global power. The conquest of Granada and the discovery of the New World marked a turning point. Spain was no longer just another European kingdom. It was on the verge of becoming something much larger, an empire that stretched across oceans, connecting Europe, Africa, the Americas, and eventually Asia. The early years of this expansion were marked by ambition and brutality. Spanish explorers, known as conquistadors, set sail to claim lands in the name of the crown, marched into the heart of Mexico, toppling the Aztec Empire with a combination of superior weaponry, alliances with local enemies, and the devastating spread of disease. Francisco Pizarro followed in South America, capturing the Inca Empire with similar ruthlessness. Gold and silver began to flow back to Spain in astonishing quantities from the mines of present-day Bolivia. Tons of silver crossed the Atlantic, filling Spanish treasuries and fueling European economies. The wealth seemed endless, and Spain's rulers believed they were chosen by God to lead a global Catholic empire. And yet, even in this early stage, the seeds of difficulty were being sown. Managing faraway colonies required immense resources. Native populations resisted Spanish rule, often violently. Piracy, rival European powers, and the sheer distance across oceans meant that Spain's control was never absolute. Still, by the early 1500s, Spain had positioned itself as a dominant force, its influence extending far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, the birth of Spain's empire was not a single event, but a convergence of victories, the unification of crowns, the conquest of Granada, and the voyages across the Atlantic. Together, these threads wove the beginnings of what would become the first truly global empire in history. And so, as the 16th century dawned, Spain stood at the threshold of greatness. Its kings and queens looked across the seas and saw not limits, but opportunities. The empire was young, ambitious, and filled with a belief in its divine mission. The rise had begun.
The 16th century opened a new chapter for Spain. What had begun with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest of Granada, and the voyages of Columbus was now evolving into something far larger than anyone in Castile or Aragon could have imagined. Spain was no longer simply a kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula. It was becoming the center of a vast and far-reaching network of power, wealth, and influence that spanned continents. The early decades of the 1500s brought Spain face to face with its newfound empire. The voyages of Columbus had revealed territories in the Caribbean, but soon larger and more ambitious expeditions pushed deeper into the Americas. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 and, within just 2 years, brought down the mighty Aztec Empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan was shocking in its scale and consequences. A city of temples, markets, and canals was reduced to rubble, replaced by Spanish settlements built on its ruins. Not long after, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition into the Andes, targeting the Inca Empire. In 1533, he captured Atahualpa, the Inca ruler, and despite receiving a room filled with gold and silver as ransom, the Spaniards executed him. The Inca Empire, already weakened by civil war and European diseases, crumbled. What remained of its cities and traditions fell under Spanish rule. With these conquests, Spain claimed vast stretches of land. Mexico, Peru, and much of Central and South America became colonies of the Spanish crown. These lands brought extraordinary wealth. Silver flowed from the mines of Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Gold, too, crossed the Atlantic. Each year, great fleets of ships sailed from the Americas to Spain, their holds heavy with treasure. This wealth made Spain the richest kingdom in Europe, at least in appearance. The silver-funded armies built palaces and gave the Spanish monarchy the means to expand its influence across the continent. But it also encouraged dependence. Instead of building strong industries at home, Spain relied on the endless supply of silver to purchase goods from other nations. What seemed like a blessing carried within it the seeds of future weakness. The reign of Charles V, who inherited the Spanish crown in 1516, marked the true beginning of Spain's global power. Charles was not only King of Spain, but also Holy Roman Emperor, ruling lands that stretched across much of Europe. His dominion included Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and the colonies overseas. It was said that the sun never set on his empire. Under Charles, Spain became a cornerstone of European politics, engaged in wars against France, the Ottoman Turks, and Protestant princes within the Holy Roman Empire. When Charles abdicated in 1556, his vast holdings were divided. His son, Philip II, inherited Spain, its American colonies, the Netherlands, and territories in Italy, while his brother Ferdinand received the Habsburg lands in Central Europe. Philip II, ruling from his grand palace at El Escorial, became the symbol of Spanish power. Under him, Spain reached the height of its influence. Philip saw himself as the defender of Catholicism in an age of religious upheaval. When Protestantism spread across Northern Europe, Spain stood firmly as the champion of the Catholic Church. Spanish armies fought in the Netherlands to suppress rebellion, while Spanish influence extended into Italy and beyond. In 1580, Philip even added Portugal to his realms, uniting the entire Iberian Peninsula under his crown. Yet Spain's power was not limited to Europe and the Americas. The empire extended into Asia. Spanish explorers crossed the Pacific and reached the Philippines, named in honor of King Philip II. From Manila, Spain established trade routes that connected Asia to the Americas. Silver from Mexico and Peru was shipped across the ocean to Manila, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. From there, goods traveled back to Europe. The Spanish Empire had become a truly global network, linking continents in trade, culture, and politics. But with this power came challenges. The Dutch rebelled against Spanish rule, beginning a long war that drained Spain's resources. England, under Queen Elizabeth II, became an enemy as well, supporting the Dutch and launching raids against Spanish treasure fleets. The most famous clash came in 1588, when Philip II sent the Spanish Armada to invade England. The great fleet of over 100 ships sailed proudly into the English Channel, only to be battered by storms and outmaneuvered by smaller, faster English vessels. The defeat of the Armada was not the end of Spain's power, but it was a symbolic blow. For the first time, Spain's might appeared vulnerable. Still, by the end of the 16th century, Spain remained the most powerful empire in the world. Its kings commanded armies across Europe. Its galleons carried treasure from the New World. Its missionaries spread Catholicism from Mexico to Manila. The sun truly did not set on its empire. Yet beneath this glittering surface, problems were beginning to form. The endless wars drained the treasury. Inflation, fueled by the flood of silver, destabilized the economy. Dependence on treasure made Spain fragile, even as it appeared strong. Thus, the 16th century marked Spain's rise to global power. It was a century of conquest, wealth, and ambition, but also of strain, resistance, and growing cracks. The empire stood tall, admired, and feared by its rivals. But the weight of its own greatness was already beginning to pull it downward. The 16th and early 17th centuries are often remembered as the Siglo de Oro, or the Golden Age of Spain. It was a period when Spanish power seemed unshakable, when its wealth dazzled Europe, and when its art, literature, and culture flourished. Yet, like so many golden ages in history, this brilliance came with heavy costs. Behind the shine lay cracks that would eventually grow into fractures. To begin, we must consider what made this era golden. The Spanish Empire commanded vast territories across the globe. Its armies fought in wars that shaped Europe. Its ships carried silver across the seas, and its monarchs sat at the heart of Catholic Europe. Spain's position was unrivaled, and its rulers projected confidence, authority, and grandeur. At the same time, Spanish art and literature reached extraordinary heights. Writers such as Miguel de Cervantes gave the world Don Quixote, a work often called the first modern novel. Cervantes, who lived through Spain's wars and crises, created a character whose misadventures reflected the complexities of his age, the tension between dreams of glory and the reality of decline. Painters such as El Greco and later Diego Velázquez captured Spain's religious fervor, its royal courts, and its dramatic sense of life and death. The cathedrals, palaces, and plazas built during this period still stand as monuments to Spain's ambition and taste. But beneath the cultural brilliance lay deeper strains. Spain's empire demanded constant defense. In the Netherlands, Protestant rebels continued their long struggle against Spanish rule, leading to one of the most draining wars of the century. Spanish troops, though skilled and feared, found themselves caught in endless campaigns that consumed both money and lives. Meanwhile, the riches from the Americas began to create unexpected problems. The flood of silver that had once filled Spain's coffers now fueled inflation. Prices rose steadily across Europe, and while Spain was rich in appearance, its economy became increasingly unstable. Wealth flowed quickly out of Spain as the crown purchased weapons, food, and manufactured goods from other nations rather than building strong industries at home. Spanish farmers and craftsmen struggled, while foreign merchants profited from Spain's treasure. The monarchy, ambitious and determined to maintain Spain's global dominance, relied heavily on loans to finance its wars. Time and again, Spain declared bankruptcy, unable to keep pace with the costs of empire. The grandeur of Philip II's court at El Escorial masked the reality of debt and financial strain. Religion, too, shaped this era. Spain presented itself as the defender of Catholicism in an age of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The Inquisition enforced religious orthodoxy at home, while missionaries carried Catholicism abroad. From Mexico to the Philippines, churches rose, bells rang, and rituals familiar in Seville or Toledo took root in distant lands. Yet this religious zeal also contributed to conflict. Spain's wars were often framed as holy struggles, whether against Protestants in Northern Europe or Muslims in the Mediterranean. Such wars drained resources while intensifying resistance among Spain's enemies. One of the most famous episodes of the Golden Age was the battle between Spain and England. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 did not destroy Spain's empire, but it did symbolize the limits of its power. Despite its vast fleets and armies, Spain could not impose its will on every rival. England, the Dutch Republic, and later France emerged as challengers, gradually eroding Spain's dominance. Within Spain itself, social tensions grew. The nobility remained powerful and consumed much of the wealth, while peasants and workers carried heavy burdens. Agricultural productivity lagged, and recurring plagues and famines made life difficult for ordinary people. The glittering wealth of empire was not evenly shared. For many Spaniards, life in the Golden Age meant hardship rather than prosperity. Thus, the Golden Age was both a peak and a warning. Spain reached extraordinary cultural and political heights, but its foundations were weaker than they appeared. The empire stretched across the world, yet it was overextended. Its armies were strong, yet constantly at war. Its economy was filled with silver, yet hollow within. The irony of the Golden Age is that it contained within it the causes of decline: inflation, debt, constant war, and reliance on treasure rather than industry, all weakened Spain, even as it appeared most powerful. By the early 17th century, Spain's rivals were growing stronger, while Spain itself struggled under the weight of its empire. And so, the Golden Age shines brightly in memory. But in truth, it was also an age of strain. Spain stood tall, its culture unmatched, its armies respected. But the costs of greatness were beginning to pull it downward. The empire was still mighty, yet the slow process of decline had already begun. By the early 17th century, the Spanish Empire, once the envy of the world, began to show unmistakable signs of decline. The empire was vast, stretching across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, but it was also overextended, drained by endless wars, weakened by economic troubles, and burdened by a monarchy that struggled to balance ambition with reality. The decline did not come suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like the slow dimming of a great flame. Spain was still powerful, still feared, and still wealthy. But beneath the surface, the problems that had taken root during the Golden Age grew deeper. One of the most pressing issues was war. Spain remained entangled in the long conflict in the Netherlands, where Protestant rebels resisted Spanish rule. This struggle, known as the 80 Years' War, dragged on for generations, consuming enormous amounts of money and manpower. Spanish soldiers, once feared as the finest in Europe, were stretched thin. The victories that had once come swiftly were now harder to achieve, and defeats became more frequent. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, added further strain. This conflict engulfed much of Europe, pitting Catholic and Protestant powers against one another. Spain, as the staunch defender of Catholicism, poured men and treasure into the fight. Battles raged across the German states, and the war dragged on for decades, draining Spain's resources. Even when Spanish armies achieved victories, the cost was staggering. Economically, Spain's troubles deepened. The once glorious flow of silver from the Americas slowed. Mines became harder to work, and the wealth that still arrived was not enough to cover the kingdom's debts. Inflation continued to erode the value of money, and repeated bankruptcies undermined confidence in Spain's ability to govern its finances. Other European powers, such as England and the Dutch Republic, built strong commercial economies based on trade and industry, while Spain remained dependent on treasure from its colonies. The monarchy, too, faced challenges. After the death of Philip II in 1598, his successors struggled to live up to his authority. Philip III, Philip IV, and later Charles II were weaker rulers, often relying on advisors and favorites to manage the empire. Corruption and inefficiency spread through the government. Grand palaces and ceremonies maintained the image of power, but behind the facade, Spain's ability to control its vast empire was weakening. Social tensions grew as well. Heavy taxation fell on peasants and commoners, while the nobility maintained privileges and wealth. Agricultural productivity remained poor, and repeated plagues devastated the population. Regions such as Catalonia and Portugal resisted Spanish authority, leading to uprisings. In 1640, Portugal successfully broke away, ending decades of union under the Spanish crown. The empire's military struggles came to a head in the mid-17th century. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, Spanish forces suffered a devastating defeat against the French. For over a century, the Spanish infantry, known as the tercios, had been considered nearly unbeatable. At Rocroi, that reputation was shattered. The battle symbolized the decline of Spanish military dominance in Europe. By the end of the century, Spain was no longer the strongest power in Europe. France, under Louis XIV, had risen to prominence, while England and the Dutch Republic controlled the seas and expanded their colonial empires. Spain, though still vast in territory, was weakened and vulnerable. The crisis deepened with the death of Charles II in 1700, known as the Bewitched, because of his poor health and deformities. Charles left no heir. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, as rival powers fought over who would inherit Spain's throne. The conflict dragged on for more than a decade, involving nearly every major European power. When it ended in 1714, Spain had lost many of its European territories, including the Netherlands and lands in Italy. What remained was still an empire. Spain retained its colonies in the Americas, the Philippines, and parts of Africa, but its role as Europe's dominant power had ended. The long struggle to maintain greatness had drained the kingdom. Spain entered the 18th century weakened, its glory fading, its empire fragile. Thus, the decline was not a single event, but a long series of struggles. endless wars, mounting debts, social unrest, and weak monarchs, Spain's empire had risen with breathtaking speed, reached astonishing heights, but now found itself slowly unraveling. The struggle to hold on to greatness defined this era. Spain remained proud, and its culture and traditions endured, but the decline was undeniable. The empire that had once stretched across the world now faced the reality of its own limits. By the 18th century, Spain was no longer the supreme power of Europe. The days of Philip II's grandeur, when Spanish treasure fleets dazzled the continent and armies marched with unmatched confidence, had passed. What remained was still a formidable empire, but one increasingly fragile, its foundations weakened by centuries of war, debt, and resistance from within its colonies. The War of the Spanish Succession had already stripped Spain of many of its European possessions. The Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and other territories that had once been part of Spain's far-reaching dominion now belonged to rival powers. Yet Spain still controlled vast colonies across the Americas, as well as the Philippines and territories in Africa. For a time, these colonies seemed to offer stability, but the seeds of collapse were already planted. Throughout the 18th century, Spanish rulers attempted reforms to strengthen the empire. The Bourbon dynasty, beginning with Philip V, sought to modernize administration, improve taxation, and tighten control over the colonies. Known as the Bourbon reforms, these changes aimed to make Spain more efficient and competitive against rivals such as Britain and France. New trade regulations opened colonial commerce, and efforts were made to reduce corruption. But these reforms had mixed results. While they increased revenues for the crown, they also created resentment in the colonies. Local elites, criollos, people of Spanish descent, born in the Americas, grew frustrated with restrictions placed upon them. Indigenous communities and enslaved populations faced harsher demands. The empire appeared orderly on the surface, but discontent was building beneath. The real turning point came in the early 19th century. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, forcing King Ferdinand VII to abdicate. The French occupation of Spain plunged the kingdom into chaos, while Spaniards at home launched a fierce guerrilla war against Napoleon's armies. The colonies across the Atlantic seized the opportunity to act. With the Spanish monarchy weakened and distracted, independence movements spread throughout Latin America. Leaders such as Simón Bolívar in the north and José de San Martín in the south rallied support for independence. Battles were fought across Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and beyond. By the 1820s, most of Spain's colonies in the Americas had broken free, establishing independent nations. The empire that had once stretched across 2 continents was reduced to scattered holdings. The loss of Latin America was devastating. For centuries, silver, gold, and agricultural products from the Americas had fueled Spain's economy. Now, that wealth was gone. What remained were smaller possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a few territories in Africa. Spain was no longer a global superpower. It had been surpassed by Britain, France, and even the rising power of the United States. The final blow came at the end of the 19th century. In 1898, after tensions with the United States, Spain fought the Spanish-American War. The conflict was brief, but decisive. Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. What little remained of its overseas empire was gone. For Spain, the defeat was more than military. It was psychological. The empire that had once circled the globe had finally collapsed. After 1898, Spain turned inward. No longer an imperial giant, it became a nation struggling with its own identity, facing political instability, civil war, and dictatorship in the 20th century. The grand days of empire were over, remembered with both pride and sorrow. The final fall of Spain's empire was not a single event, but a long, drawn-out process. From the Armada's defeat in 1588 to the bankruptcy of the 17th century to the loss of Latin America in the early 19th, and finally, the disaster of 1898, Spain's decline spanned centuries. What had risen so quickly, what had shone so brightly, faded slowly, piece by piece, until only memory remained. Thus ended the empire on which the sun never set. It had changed the world through conquest, colonization, trade, and culture, but it could not escape the forces of resistance, competition, and its own internal weaknesses. The fall was final, but the legacy endured. Even after the final fall of the Spanish Empire, its influence did not vanish. Though Spain no longer ruled vast territories across the globe, the marks of its centuries-long dominance remained, quietly shaping the world in ways both visible and subtle. To understand the legacy of Spain's empire, one must look not only at maps or treaties, but at language, religion, culture, architecture, economy, and identity. Perhaps the most obvious and enduring legacy is language. Spanish, or Castellano, spread across the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Philippines during the empire's height. Today, it is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. From Mexico City to Buenos Aires, from Havana to Manila, the influence of Spanish is unmistakable. Words, expressions, and grammatical structures brought across oceans centuries ago continue to shape communication in these regions. Language became more than a tool. It became a thread linking people, culture, and identity across continents. Religion was another key legacy. The Catholic Church, closely aligned with the Spanish crown, traveled wherever Spanish authority reached. Missionaries converted populations from Mexico to Peru, from the Philippines to the Caribbean. Churches rose in the centers of cities, bells tolled over plazas, and rituals and festivals carried the imprint of Spanish faith. While the spread of Catholicism was often accompanied by violence and suppression of indigenous beliefs, it also created enduring traditions. Religious festivals, holy days, and the architecture of cathedrals remain part of cultural life in former colonies. The empire also left its mark in urban planning and architecture. Spanish cities in the Americas were often built with central plazas, surrounded by churches, government buildings, and markets. This grid system, combined with European architectural styles, created a distinct urban aesthetic that persists today. Cities such as Mexico City, Lima, and Manila still bear the signature of Spanish colonial design. Streets, squares, and churches remain living reminders of the empire's presence. Cultural blending, or mestizaje, was another consequence of Spanish rule. The mixing of Spanish, indigenous, and African peoples created complex societies with unique traditions. Music, dance, cuisine, and art all reflect this blend. Flamenco rhythms absorbed African influences, while local storytelling traditions combined with Catholic saints' tales in Mexico and Peru. The Spanish Empire did not merely export culture, it facilitated cultural fusion, producing new and lasting identities. Economically, Spain's empire contributed to the early globalization of trade. Silver from the Americas fueled European markets, and trade routes extended from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and back again. The Manila galleons carried not only silver, but also silk, porcelain, and other goods, connecting continents long before modern globalization. These networks shaped global commerce, creating interconnections that still resonate in today's economies. Yet the legacy was not without its darker aspects. Conquest, forced labor, and exploitation left deep scars. Entire populations were decimated by disease and warfare. Indigenous societies were transformed, often violently, and many traditional practices were lost. The empire's wealth was often extracted at great human cost. Understanding Spain's legacy requires acknowledging both its achievements and its burdens. Even today, debates continue about the empire's meaning. In Spain, there is pride in the accomplishments of the Golden Age, yet awareness of the costs of conquest and colonization tempers that pride. In Latin America and the Philippines, the empire is remembered with both pain and recognition of the cultural and linguistic transformations it produced. The legacy is complex, layered, and often contradictory. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire reshaped the world. It connected continents, spread language and faith, influenced culture and society, and helped create the foundations of the modern global economy. Its political and military power may have faded, but its imprint remains visible in streets, churches, languages, and traditions, and in less visible ways, in the blended identities and histories of millions. To study the Spanish Empire is to recognize the endurance of human endeavor, both noble and tragic. It reminds us that empires may fall, but their effects echo long after the last ship has sailed, the last garrison has surrendered, and the last king has died. Spain's epic empire, with all its rise and fall, continues to live, not as a political entity, but as a lasting influence on the world we inhabit today. Even centuries after its collapse, the Spanish Empire continues to influence the world in ways both subtle and profound. Unlike the physical structures that crumble or the armies that disband, the empire's imprint persists in culture, language, religion, governance, and thought. This final part examines those enduring influences, drawing a line from past to present. Consider governance. Spain's empire introduced bureaucratic systems designed to manage vast territories. Viceroys, audiencias, and colonial councils were implemented to maintain order across continents and oceans. These administrative structures shaped political practices in the Americas long after independence. Countries such as Mexico, Peru, and Colombia inherited governance models that bore the mark of Spanish colonial organization, sometimes combining them with indigenous traditions to create hybrid systems of authority. Trade and economic patterns also reveal the empire's long shadow. The movement of silver and gold not only enriched Spain, but created early networks of global commerce. The Manila galleons connected Asia, the Americas, and Europe, laying the groundwork for trans-Pacific trade. These trade routes established patterns that would influence global markets for centuries, helping to usher in what historians now call the early modern globalization. Culturally, the legacy is vast. Art, literature, music, and religion all carry echoes of Spain's influence. The literary styles of the Siglo de Oro continue to inspire writers, while architectural motifs, Baroque churches, central plazas, colonial palaces still define the urban landscape in former colonies. Religious festivals, rituals, and celebrations introduced by missionaries remain integral to community life, blending with indigenous and African traditions to create unique local identities. Yet the impact is not uniformly positive. The Spanish Empire also introduced systems of forced labor, racial hierarchies, and exploitation that had long-term consequences for social inequality. Indigenous populations were decimated by disease and conquest, and African slaves were brought to work in mines and plantations. The empire's influence thus includes both cultural enrichment and profound human suffering. To understand Spain's legacy fully is to confront both sides, the achievements and the costs. The empire also shaped identity. Across Latin America, the Philippines, and even in parts of Africa, people live within cultural and linguistic frameworks that originated under Spanish rule. Spanish surnames, holidays, cuisine, and legal systems remain, forming a web of shared heritage. These enduring influences reveal how an empire, even after its political power has vanished, continues to mold the lives of millions. Finally, Spain's epic empire offers lessons about the nature of power. Greatness can rise quickly, but is fragile. Without sustainable economic, political, and social foundations, military might and wealth can achieve dominance, but overextension, internal weakness, and resistance from subjugated peoples can erode even the strongest states. In this sense, Spain's story is not only historical, but also cautionary reminder that empires, no matter how dazzling, must contend with both opportunity and consequence. Thus, as we reflect on Spain's epic empire, we recognize it as more than a sequence of victories, defeats, and riches. It was an experiment in global governance, a crucible of cultural exchange, and a source of profound human impact. Though the empire no longer exists, its echoes remain. Language, faith, urban design, governance, and collective memory all carry traces of Spain's centuries-long reach. In the end, the rise and fall of Spain's empire reminds us that history is never fully past. Empires leave marks that outlast armies, treaties, and crowns, and Spain, despite its decline, continues to shape the modern world in ways both obvious and hidden, enduring long after the last galleon has sunk beneath the waves. Even as the Spanish Empire faded from political prominence, its social, economic, and cultural consequences continued to shape the world. Understanding these consequences requires a careful look at the everyday realities of life under Spanish rule, as well as the long-term effects that persisted after independence. Economically, the empire's policies created both prosperity and imbalance. The extraction of silver and gold from the Americas brought immense wealth to Spain, but it also fostered dependency. Spanish merchants and rulers relied on colonial riches to fund wars, palaces, and courtly life, rather than investing in domestic industry or agriculture. The result was an economy that appeared rich, but was structurally fragile. Inflation became endemic, prices rose across Europe, and Spain's population sometimes suffered from shortages despite the flow of treasure. In the colonies, economic structures imposed by Spain created rigid hierarchies. Encomiendas and haciendas concentrated land and resources in the hands of a small elite, While indigenous populations and African slaves performed the bulk of labor, mining operations, particularly in silver-rich regions like Potosi, demanded grueling work under harsh conditions. The empire's pursuit of wealth created prosperity for some and extreme hardship for others, a pattern that would echo through generations. Socially, Spanish rule reshaped identities. The rigid caste system classified people by descent: peninsulares, born in Spain; criollos, born in the Americas of Spanish ancestry; mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry; and indigenous and African populations at the bottom of the hierarchy. These divisions affected social mobility, access to education, and political power. The Spanish crown sought to maintain control by codifying social distinctions, reinforcing authority, while suppressing local autonomy. Culturally, the empire left a lasting imprint. Spanish language, law, religion, and educational practices spread throughout the colonies. Universities and schools established by religious orders trained colonial elites, shaping intellectual life. Catholicism, in particular, permeated daily life, influencing festivals, moral codes, and community organization. Even after independence, these cultural structures remained embedded in local societies. The blending of cultures also produced unique outcomes. Indigenous art forms merged with European styles, African rhythms, and musical traditions mixed with Spanish forms, and cuisine evolved through the introduction of New World crops combined with Iberian cooking. This cultural syncretism, mestizaje, became a defining feature of Latin American societies. However, these consequences were not uniformly positive. Resistance and rebellion were common responses to oppression, taxation, and forced labor. Revolts erupted in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. Indigenous groups sought to maintain traditions despite missionary efforts to convert them. African slaves preserved elements of their heritage despite the brutality of enslavement. The empire's influence was pervasive, but it also generated persistent conflict. Even in Spain itself, the empire's consequences were felt. Reliance on colonial wealth discouraged domestic economic development, leaving the country vulnerable to external competition. Political centralization and courtly extravagance masked inefficiency and corruption. Spain's internal challenges reflected the costs of maintaining a vast global empire. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire shaped the world far beyond the battlefield or the palace. It influenced social hierarchies, economic patterns, cultural practices, and human identities across continents. Its consequences were long-lasting, complex, and deeply intertwined with the histories of Spain and its former colonies. To study the empire is to understand both its achievements and its burdens, recognizing that power leaves enduring marks even after it fades from view. Empires do not vanish when their territories are lost or when their armies disband. They linger in memory, in culture, and in the ways societies understand themselves. The Spanish Empire, though it collapsed more than a century ago, remains alive in the memories of nations and peoples across the globe. To conclude this exploration, we turn to the ways Spain's epic empire is remembered today and how that memory shapes modern identity. In Spain itself, the empire's legacy is contested. For some, it is a source of pride, a golden chapter in which Spanish explorers, soldiers, and missionaries spread influence across oceans, carrying faith, language, and culture. For others, it is a reminder of overreach, decline, and the eventual loss of power. Spanish history textbooks, public debates, and cultural institutions continue to wrestle with how to present the empire as triumph, tragedy, or something in between. In Latin America, memory is equally complex. Independence movements of the 19th century celebrated liberation from Spanish control, yet the cultural foundations laid during centuries of rule remain deeply embedded. Spanish language, Catholic faith, legal traditions, and architectural legacies are part of daily life. National identities in Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and elsewhere cannot be separated from their colonial pasts. The empire is remembered as both oppressor and shaper, as both burden and foundation. In the Philippines, too, Spain's presence endures. Centuries of Spanish rule introduced Catholicism, European-style governance, and Hispanic surnames. Yet the Filipino identity is not simply Spanish. It is a layered blend of indigenous, Asian, and colonial influences. Spain's memory lingers, but always in dialogue with other traditions. In Africa, where Spain retained only small holdings, the empire's legacy is less visible, but still present. Ceuta and Melilla, Spanish enclaves on the North African coast, remain reminders of Spain's imperial footprint. Elsewhere, Spain's role is overshadowed by the larger presence of other colonial powers. Yet its imprint is part of the broader story of European expansion. Globally, Spain's empire is remembered in monuments, literature, and collective imagination. The voyages of Columbus, the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, the grandeur of Seville and Madrid, the Manila galleons, all remain part of world history. They appear in museums, history books, and cultural works, shaping how people understand the early modern era. Yet memory is not static. In recent decades, debates about colonialism, slavery, and indigenous rights have reshaped how Spain's empire is remembered. Statues have been questioned, narratives revised, and voices once silenced have begun to be heard. Memory is no longer controlled solely by the victors. It is contested, re-examined, and reframed by those who seek to tell the story from other perspectives. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire lives on not in crowns or armies, but in memory and identity. It shaped languages, religions, traditions, and even the way nations see themselves. Its memory is both proud and painful, both celebrated and mourned. To remember Spain's empire is to grapple with contradiction, glory and suffering, creation and destruction, rise and fall, and perhaps this is the final lesson of Spain's epic saga. Empires do not end when they collapse. They continue in memory, in debate, in the identities of peoples across the globe. Spain's empire may have fallen, but its memory ensures that it remains endlessly studied, endlessly discussed, endlessly remembered. History, at its deepest level, is not only about events and dates, victories and defeats. It is also about echoes, traces of what once was, reverberating long after the moment has passed. Spain's empire, which once stretched across oceans and continents, now exists only in memory, in culture, and in the silent persistence of its legacies. Yet in those echoes, it still speaks. One hears the echo in language. Hundreds of millions of people across the Americas converse daily in Spanish, often without thinking of the voyages and conquests that first brought the language across the sea. Literature, poetry, and everyday speech continue to carry the sound of Spain's empire, not as a ruling force, but as part of lived identity. The echo is also present in architecture, in plazas where cathedrals rise, in colonial era streets still walked by millions. The stones carry whispers of empire. Though kings and viceroys are long gone, their urban designs remain not as monuments of power, but as ordinary backdrops to modern life. It lingers too in religion. Bells that ring for Mass in Mexico, Peru, or the Philippines ring with tones first carried across the Atlantic. Festivals blending Catholic saints with indigenous traditions mark calendars across Latin America. These rituals no longer serve a Spanish crown, but they remind us that empires do not vanish without leaving spiritual traces. Economically, the empire's echo is subtler. The global networks of trade it helped establish between Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia created patterns of exchange that shaped the modern world economy. Today's globalized commerce still flows along routes first carved by ships flying Spain's flag, but the echoes are not only of grandeur, they are also of suffering, the memory of conquest, of forced labor, of slavery, of suppression of indigenous traditions. These too endure. They surface in debates about identity, in the struggles of marginalized communities, in the ways nations confront or conceal their colonial pasts. The echo is as much about pain as it is about power. In Spain itself, the echo shapes identity. Pride in a golden past coexists with awareness of decline. The memory of empire becomes a mirror, reflecting questions of who the Spanish people are and who they were. In the former colonies, the echo shapes national identity in another way, forcing a reckoning with the contradictions of heritage, of languages imposed yet embraced, of religions once foreign, now deeply familiar. Thus, the Spanish Empire endures not as an empire, but as an echo, vibrating quietly through the present. Its rise and fall are complete, its armies dispersed, its kings long buried, yet in plazas, languages, traditions, and debates, the empire still whispers, reminding us that history never disappears fully. In the end, perhaps this is the true measure of empire, not in the size of its armies or the wealth of its treasure fleets, but in the endurance of its echoes. Spain's empire has fallen, yet it remains, not in power, but in memory, in identity, in culture, and in the quiet persistence of history itself. Every empire rises with ambition, expands with energy, flourishes with wealth, and eventually declines under the weight of its own contradictions. Spain's empire is not an exception. It is a vivid example of this cycle, one among many in human history. Yet in its rise and fall, there are lessons that continue to speak to us. The first lesson is the danger of overextension. Spain, flush with silver from the Americas, fought wars across Europe, maintained fleets across oceans, and attempted to hold too much for too long. The riches of empire made expansion possible, but they also concealed fragility. No wealth, however vast, can compensate for overreach without sustainable foundations. The second lesson is the cost of exploitation. Spain's empire was built on the labor of millions indigenous peoples in the Americas, enslaved Africans, and poor laborers in Spain itself. The profits of conquest and mining enriched the crown and elite, but at immense human cost. This exploitation left scars that did not fade with independence, shaping social and economic inequalities that persist into the modern world. The third lesson is the endurance of culture. Though the empire itself collapsed, its languages, religions, and traditions endured. Conquest is temporary. Cultural exchange, even when born of violence, often proves lasting. Spain's empire shows that what survives of empire is not its political power, but the cultural imprints it leaves behind. The fourth lesson is the inevitability of decline. No empire, however grand, escapes the passage of time. Spain's fall reminds us that power is never permanent. Circumstances change, rivals emerge, and internal weaknesses grow. Empires, like individuals, live within the limits of history. The final lesson is humility. Spain's empire once seemed invincible. Its rulers believed they presided over a realm where the sun never set. Yet within centuries, it had fractured and collapsed, leaving Spain diminished and its colonies independent. This is not just Spain's story, but a reminder to all nations and peoples. Greatness is never eternal. These lessons extend beyond history. They speak to the nature of human ambition, the costs of power, and the transience of achievement. Spain's empire, in all its glory and tragedy, offers us not just a record of the past, but a mirror for the present. In the end, the story of Spain's empire is not only about Spain, it is about empire itself, its possibilities, its consequences, its rise and fall. It teaches us to look at history not as distant, but as alive, offering warnings, reflections, and wisdom for those who listen. Thus, the saga closes not with conquest or collapse, but with a lesson that power fades, but history endures, quietly reminding us that all empires rise and all empires fall. Spain's empire was vast, but it was not unique. Across history, empires have risen, flourished, and fallen, each believing itself exceptional, each discovering that history is stronger than pride. To understand Spain's story is to place it within the larger cycle of civilizations. The Roman Empire once stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It built roads, aqueducts, and laws that outlasted its armies. Yet it too collapsed under pressure invaders at the gates, corruption within, and an economy strained beyond repair. Rome's ruins stand as silent testimony that no power is eternal. Centuries later, Spain rose, fueled by discovery and conquest. It claimed the Americas, the Philippines, and vast wealth from silver mines. It believed, as Rome once did, that its dominion would last forever. But like Rome, Spain faced the limits of overreach, the resistance of subject peoples, and the slow erosion of strength. Its empire, once unrivaled, became a memory. Britain followed. At its height, its empire stretched even farther than Spain's, ruling over lands on every continent. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," once applied to Spain, was later claimed for Britain. Yet Britain too discovered the limits of power. Wars, revolts, and the costs of maintaining global dominance brought decline. By the mid-20th century, much of Britain's empire had vanished, leaving behind only echoes of influence. Other empires, Ottoman, Mughal, Portuguese, Dutch, French, rose and fell in similar fashion. Each carried ambition, each shaped the world, each eventually faded. Spain's story, then, is not only Spain's. It is part of this broader human pattern. Empires are built by ambition, sustained by wealth, but undone by the same forces that lift them up. Overextension, resistance, economic fragility, and time itself ensure that nothing lasts forever. Today, new powers rise. Nations project influence across oceans through trade, technology, and culture. Some speak of global dominance, of unchallenged supremacy, yet Spain's empire reminds us that such dreams are always temporary. The wheel of history turns, lifting some, lowering others, without pause. The cycle of civilizations continues. Spain's epic empire, with all its grandeur and its decline, is one chapter in a long book. Rome wrote an earlier chapter, Britain a later one, and the future will write others still. The lesson is simple. Though empires rarely hear it while they are strong, all power fades, all empires fall, but their echoes remain to shape what comes next. In this way, Spain's empire is more than a national story. It is a universal story, a mirror for every civilization. Its rise shows what human ambition can achieve. Its fall shows the limits of that ambition. Its legacy endures as both memory and warning. Thus, the saga of Spain does not end with Spain alone. It joins the endless cycle of civilizations, where the rise and fall of empires remind us of history's most constant truth, that nothing endures forever except the memory of what once was.